As you were likely just notified on your screen, this meeting is being recorded, or webinar, excuse me, is being recorded, and I will share more on that in just a moment. Whoops. Alrighty. Well, it's just afternoon, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. We have our partners and our sponsors, actually, from the Berkley Group with us today, which we're excited about. They will be presenting Foundations of Success, Navigating Procurement and Project Management in Planning. I will go through introductions in just a moment, but please note the CM number. I will also drop that in the chat momentarily. But again, thank you so much to the Berkley Group for sponsoring our Your Hour with APA Virginia webinar series. It is held the fourth Monday of each month. Alrighty, I will drop some links to our chapter and our conference website. I know that we just added our slide decks and some of our pictures from the awards to our conference correspondence. So I will drop those in the chat as well. So we really do encourage questions. Oops. We really do encourage questions, but please submit your questions through the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box. That will just help us keep track of all inquiries. You can use the raise hand feature to request to be unmuted if you'd prefer to ask your question out loud during the more formal Q&A towards the end. But feel free to drop those questions in the Q&A throughout the webinar, and we will get to those at the end. Feel free to DM me in the chat if you have any logistical questions or if there's any points in time for any open engagement. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and introduce our speakers a little bit more as they put up their slides. Alrighty. Today we have Michael Zehner, the Director of Planning and Community Development at the Berkley Group. Michael has 25 years of public service and planning experience. Throughout his career, he has led planning activities in Georgia, North Carolina, Massachusetts, and Virginia. Immediately prior to joining Berkley Group, Michael served as Director of Planning and Development for the town of Nags Head, North Carolina, managing the town's current development and long-range planning activities. With the Berkley Group, Michael oversees the company's planning and community development divisions responsible for both long-range land use planning services and current development services. He has managed a spectrum of planning-related matters, developing solutions to challenging problems. Michael's a certified planner with a bachelor's degree in political science from Virginia Tech. We also have Rebecca Cobb, Deputy Director of Planning, who has 17 years of planning experience, having served as the planning zoning administrator for Buckingham County, Virginia, prior to joining Berkley Group. In her work with Berkley Group, she has collaborated on comprehensive plan, utilized GIS for data collection and mapping, and led zoning and subdivision ordinance updates, amendments, and diagnostics for localities across the state of Virginia. Her grassroots experience allows her to understand all views at the table and brings them together cohesively for the betterment of the community. She has a bachelor's degree in biology with a minor in environmental science from Longwood University. And lastly, we have Kate Jones, Deputy Director of Community Development, who is a planner and licensed North Carolina landscape architect. Kate has worked with numerous local governments and nonprofit groups as a consultant on park design and planning projects. Kate also brings several years of experience working in local government for the town of Nags Head, where she led park planning and design projects, wrote and managed North Carolina Parks and Recreation Trust Fund grant applications, as well as led public engagement efforts for various planning projects. With Berkley Group, Kate oversees hazard mitigation plan, resiliency plans, and ongoing community development activities for numerous localities. She has a master's in landscape architecture from the University of British Columbia and a bachelor's in biology and environmental studies from the College of Charleston. So we have some excellent and excellent presenters with us this afternoon to present on project management in planning. So I'm really grateful for their participation, excuse me, in our series, and I will hand it over. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you, Jillian. And are my slides appearing okay?
Yes, perfect.
Great. So thank you for the introduction. Here's our presentation is again on foundations for success, navigating procurement and project management and planning. And I'll go over the scope of what we hope to convey to you all today. But before that, again, introductions. My name is Michael Zehner, and with me are Rebecca Cobb and Kate Jones. And this team, you know, and a lot of us with the Berkley Group have prior public service experience. And I think what we were hoping to get across with our team here is really our recognition of some of that experience as public employees, but now on the consultant side, and some experiences that we've had through project management and the procurement stages to hopefully deliver good projects. And again, I've been with the Berkley Group for 3 years now, and prior to that time, all of my experience was on the public side as a professional local planner. And I think we have certainly seen procurement side and project management side from that side, from the public side, but also the consultant side. And so I think, you know, hopefully we can deliver some value to you in sharing our perspectives. So Rebecca, you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Yes, Rebecca Cobb, Deputy Director of Planning with Berkley Group. And, you know, just as Michael said, you know, I agree. I was 11 plus years with Buckingham County, and so had some, you know, experiences there writing RFPs and that sort of thing. But then coming into the consulting realm for over 5 years now gives a different perspective. And so hope to share some of that today. Kate.
Oh, you're muted, Kate.
Apologies. Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Jones, as was mentioned, and just agree. We're really hoping we can provide some insights for you all that are extremely helpful moving forward. I've been on the private side about a year now, so wasn't that long ago. I was on the local government side just over a year. So I think we'll be able to kind of crisscross the two, and hopefully you'll walk away with a few learned things in your pocket.
Yeah, so between myself and Rebecca and Kate, we really, with the Berkley Group, manage all of the project delivery, all of the planning project delivery. And I expect many of you know, are familiar with the Berkley Group, but we have approximately 60 employees. All of us are remote in offices in Virginia and North Carolina, and the company specializes in administration and community development and planning, education, human resources, public safety, and much more. And all of our clients are local governments and public agencies. We don't work for the private sector. You know, yes, while we're no longer public servants ourselves, I think in a lot of ways we still think of ourselves as public servants. I would hope so. But enough about that. Let's dive in. So here is a quick summary of the webinar that I believe went out from APA. But you know, I've sat in a few sessions like this over my career. One a long time ago when I certainly was in a local government seat, and another more recently talking about consultant perspectives about project management and procurement and going through the entire life cycle of a planning project. And you know, we think there's value into giving our experience on these things, and certainly it's from our perspective, and we hope, you know, we leave time at the end for discussion and questions and answers. And I think a lot of you will have your own experiences and things that maybe will help your peers, and that's really the goal here is to share these perspectives and things that maybe you've thought about or not thought about, building that stronger foundation for projects and ensuring that you are engaging or pursuing a successful project from beginning to end. And I think that's really the goal. So why a strong foundation matters. And I think as planners, I think this is not certainly a foreign concept to us. But setting a strong project foundation really impacts ultimate project success at the end. We'll talk about these 6 really processes throughout this presentation, but really, starting with identification of the project, scoping of the project, funding, where the funding is going to come from, what your options may be there, selecting your consultant partner, staffing of the project, not just really, this is not so much focusing on the staffing on the consultant side, but local government staffing, the needs and expectations there, and then successfully getting a project across the finish line. So with the first step, project identification, what is the need or issue or challenge that's driving, the reason for the plan to be developed or the services that you're looking for? Really sit down and think about what is the solution and even what the objective may be, what the end goal may be. And then thinking about, why do you need or why do you think you need assistance from an outside consultant? Is it lack of internal capacity from a time standpoint or resource standpoint, or lack of expertise? In a lot of ways, having sat in local government seat, it hopefully wasn't a lack of expertise, but you're balancing a lot. It's a lack of potential capacity, a lack of time and resources, and needing that outside assistance to get that project delivered when you're balancing all of those things. And then in doing that prioritization, are there multiple priorities? I have no doubt that there are multiple priorities that you're dealing with on a day-to-day, year-to-year basis. And balancing all of those, and then again, considering what projects are priorities, where do you need that assistance to help you get those projects delivered? And then when you're thinking about a project and formulating what the idea is for a project, looking at examples and models of plans, projects, RFPs that may be out there, asking state listservs, asking the APA Virginia on LinkedIn. I know there are other states that have listservs that are pretty active in this way. I'm a member of both the Massachusetts Planners listserv, but also the North Carolina listserv. And there's always questions about, who's done this type of project? Can you provide an example? Cost, all of these things are things that you may want to think about when you're working to identify a project. And I would tell you, the APA Virginia LinkedIn page should serve in that same fashion. And I would encourage you, if you ever have a question about, who's done this, who's had this type of challenge, how did you address it? Those may be some good sources to explore. And I think in an emerging way, think about using generative AI tools, Chat GPT, but with the caveat to always verify, of course. But play with it, think about a prompt. I always try to explain the context when I use it, but thinking about, or when you're entering a prompt, I am a land use professional. There's a community I'm working with that has this challenge. What are some examples of other communities that have worked to address this challenge, and how did they go about it? And that may identify some examples out there that you may not have thought of. But I would, again, you have to verify some of those results from that. But it helps you maybe create a universe of some examples. And I would say a third opportunity that's not really addressed on this slide, but considering a RFI, a request for information, where it's a non-binding request from potential partners, consultants, even nonprofits that may have worked with localities in a similar fashion to solve this particular problem. And you can use an RFI to go out and say, this is the issue that we're having. How would you go about solving for this? Or what would you, what are some examples of similar work that you've done? You may not catch a lot of responses, but you may get some responses that provide some information that can help you. Let's see. So I'll turn this next slide over to Rebecca.
Yeah, so project scoping, as Michael said, it's important to establish your clear objectives and make sure they align with your project goals. And you want to set parameters and boundaries to prevent scope creep. And you want to have a clear understanding of all of your project needs and your limits, as Michael mentioned, how much staffing time do you have for this project? And also specifically list the project deliverables and your expected outcomes. You want to identify the key stakeholders. And remember that the stakeholders that you select are going to have different needs. And so what is their level of understanding? What's their level of influence within the community? What are the best methods to communicate with them to ensure that they stay informed and that they have buy-in throughout the project? Are there stakeholders who historically don't participate? And so what are some methods that you can maybe use to get them to participate? Also, anticipate challenges, everything from those resource limitations and time constraints, but also controversy. This particular project might have some controversy around it. And so think about those things, identify those issues and have an understanding of those issues and be ready to be flexible around that.
Kate?
Okay, so one of the most important, not the most important, but one of the most important elements of scoping a project is how are you going to pay for it? It's often the case that projects and plans are pursued because of availability of funding versus before that, identifying a need based on whether or not funding exists. And we do think it's really important to identify that need regardless of the funding, because when you identify the need, it gets it into the locality's plans. For example, you can put it in the 4 or 5 year plan. You kind of have like a placeholder there that means this project is important. So don't be afraid to plan for a project because of the lack of available funds today, because even though that's the case today, next year, and I think we've seen this with a lot of the grant funding becoming available at the federal, state level, funding may be available in the future. With that being said, generally, the common sources for funding are your local government budgets, and those can be comprised from a wide variety of financial mechanisms. We won't get too far into that today, but generally you'll have your general fund revenue, bonds, private public partnerships, special tax districts, impact fees, etc. And your CIP is generally funded, you all know this, can be funded through a variety of these elements. And again, it's really important that you get all the projects that are important to a locality into that CIP regardless of funding. And there are a lot of grants available. While this is really exciting on many levels, it does require that you have the capacity to write these grants. Well, backing up, first of all, to kind of identify the grants. So that's why it's important to have the need already identified, so then you can attach the grant to that need, not vice versa. And then, you really need to have the capacity on staff to write the grant, to manage the grant, and then kind of tandemly with the project that you're scoping to kind of see how those two would align, because they do need to align in order for the project to be successful. So, I think those are just kind of the key takeaways. Again, planning in advance, regardless of funding, is kind of something that we would highly suggest working into your your workflows. I think next slide, Michael. All right, so procurement options and strategies. So this is, for planning focused projects, we're generally focusing on non-professional services. However, we do sometimes partner with professional services such as engineering, architectural, etc. But the basis for local government procurement, as you all know, is governed by the Virginia Public Procurement Act. And that act establishes the guidelines and procedures for purchasing goods, services, as well as construction by public bodies. So, those regulations are there to make sure that competition is there, that there is transparency. All the while ensuring that local governments really obtain the best value for taxpayer dollars. So it is important to follow those rules, as you all know. And again, we won't go too far down explaining. I'll just give a quick overview. But I am going to put a link in the chat that is the, just in case you want to refamiliarize yourself with the actual regulatory language from the state level, that is in the chat. But depending on really the project that you're scoping, you may be interested in a competitive sealed bidding and competitive negotiation. So those are kind of two different ways of procuring projects. Competitive sealed bidding would be just that. It's basically I think in North Carolina, we called it the lowest competitive responsible bidder. So you would be required to basically accept that lowest responsible bidder, whereas the competitive negotiation gives you a little more authority to go back in. There are, of course, rules associated with both, but the competitive negotiation allows you to negotiate some aspects of price. So again, the essential difference between the two is really, it really depends on what the local government is looking for. If you're looking for something, I guess, very specific and you know exactly what you want, then maybe competitive sealed bidding would be appropriate. Whereas if you have a little more maybe flexibility to a point, you might choose, competitive negotiation. And then, of course, cooperative procurement. These words are jumbling in my mouth today, but cooperative procurement is a process where multiple public procurement entities combine. And basically they take advantage of volume purchases. It can reduce administrative costs, it can reduce time, and it's often based on the needs of multiple governments coming together. Anything else, Michael? Did you want to say anything else about that?
Yeah, I would. Some things you may want to think about, and some of this I think is in the bullets on the right, but thinking about your procurement needs relative to your timeline, if it's an issue or project, a need that needs maybe a shorter timeline and in terms of starting, you may want to explore what type of cooperative procured services are out there. I think for many of you, it's probably more apparent through a PDC, where they've arranged for on-call consultants for a variety of services. And I think if you're considering that, I think it's evaluating the reputability of the firms that are available through cooperative procurement or on-call contracts, and whether or not they can meet your need. I think another consideration is that, pursuing an RFP, it's going to be a more rigid process in some ways versus working perhaps with a entity that's been cooperatively procured. There may be some ability to more flexibly negotiate scope and cost. So just some things to take into account. And I think the last thing to mention is if you look at the Public Procurement Act, you can actually use cooperatively procured services from outside the state of Virginia as well. So if you ever find a planning process, a firm that you really liked and want to understand, are interested in potentially using them, you may want to see if they've been cooperatively procured somewhere, even in Virginia or out of state, to see about working with that entity. So there's a couple of different ways that you can pursue this. I think all of us were more familiar with the RFP process, usually through the competitive negotiation process, when you can evaluate multiple different proposals and multiple different vendors. But there are some other options out there. I'll go to the next slide.
Thanks. Okay, so components of an effective RFP. So when you're writing an RFP, generally, you want to give enough information so the respondents that are reading it have a very clear idea of what it is you're looking for. So the column on the left, of course, you want to be very clear about your objectives. What are the goals of your project? What are also the objectives of your project? Scope of work is very important. You want to be clear on the scope. I think Rebecca talked a little bit about scope drift, and that's a common issue. And I think the more concise the scope can be, the better. But we'll talk a little bit about in just a minute about still leaving room for creativity. Deliverables. So what is it you want to receive? What are the items you will take away from this project? Is it are they, sections of a report? Is it a specific study? Are there going to be even, stakeholder engagement reports, things like that? You want to be really careful and think it through based upon what it is you're looking for. Timeline. It's, I think timeline and budget are closely related, but the respondents need to understand what your timeline is and what you're looking for based on, the goals and the objectives of the locality you work for. Budget. So this is something, sometimes you see it in an RFP, sometimes you don't. I have to say that being on the local government side, we always tried to include a range at a minimum, so the respondents had something to work with. And I think that that's a really important point. If you don't include a budget, then the respondents are kind of left guessing. They're hunting it down somewhere, trying to find it. So it's probably a good idea to go ahead and give them as much information as you can, so they can produce an accurate, budget item for you. And then, hopefully the point there being that when you do receive your, all of your respondents and their proposals, that they are worth evaluating and they are as accurate as you can be at this stage. And then how will you be selecting a firm or firms? So you need to be clear so that you're evaluating all of the respondents on fair terms and they know also what it is you're looking for. I will say, tips for writing a strong RFP. So a couple pitfalls. I wanted to talk briefly about this, and this is just what I've seen and experienced being on both sides. I think that there are quite a few, but I tried to pull out just the top three. So for example, unrealistic timelines. It's, again, really important that setting deadlines that are realistic and that are not too tight for vendors to be thoughtful and thorough in their responses. There's been, quite a few that I've seen like, oh, this would be a great one. And then, you kind of look at the turnaround and you're like, we can't do that. And then of course, a lot of them that come out are very realistic and clearly have this in mind as well. So just make sure you're giving respondents enough time. Generally, I'd say err on the caution of about 40 days. I think that generally is a kind of, an overall guideline. This is where we get into, earlier I mentioned having a very clear scope of work, but don't necessarily select overly strict specifications. So tell them what you want done, but don't be too rigid in how the tasks should be accomplished. Sometimes this can stifle creativity and or innovation. So while it is important to understand what you want, be open to perhaps different ways of doing things. And then another pitfall, we kind of already mentioned, but inadequate budget information. So yep, vendors may either overestimate or underestimate their proposals, leading to proposals that are outside the project's financial scope. And you all may be able to think of other pitfalls. I would welcome you to put those in the chat if you'd like. And we can talk about those at the end.
Thank you, Kate.
Yep.
Rebecca?
And so managing the RFP process, when setting the deadlines, ensure there's sufficient time. I think you're going to hear Michael, Kate, and I say this over and over again today, but making sure there is enough time to evaluate, to coordinate, to respond to the request. RFPs are passed over because of insufficient time. If you ever had one out and you just got, 1 or 2 responses, that might have been why. There might have been, people who really wish that they could, but they just couldn't pull that response together in time. And so it's also a good idea to include some buffer days for unexpected delays and that sort of thing. Also count on vendor questions and have something set up for this communication so that they know what's the channel that they need to use to reach out, who are they reaching out to with their questions. You can schedule a Q&A session is always helpful for everyone involved as well. Or you can do a frequently asked questions document and provide that in an easy, accessible location for everyone. But just making sure that you're very responsive and transparent throughout that whole process. And then including clear, fair, measurable evaluation process that aligns with your project goals. So, consider what is most important for you in the project. Is it cost? Is it the quality? Is it innovation? What is important? And then weighing those factors accordingly. And then also involving the right stakeholders as a review team and making sure that that review team is all on the same page with that evaluation criteria. What quality means to one person may be different to someone else. So having those discussions early on about those prioritized factors. And you also want to make sure those on the review team are relevant to the project and have buy-in for the project. The team should be well-rounded, but you don't want it to be too large. That can lead to some delays and that type of thing. And yet if it's too small, then you could be creating some biased results or some stalemates. So things just to consider there as well. Next slide. And so role of local government staffing. So even though you've, put out this proposal, you've selected someone, that doesn't mean you brush your hands off and yay, this is all handled. It's actually going to take quite a bit of your time and efforts. And so, there is going to need to be an individual that leads this project internally. There's going to be people, needing to gather information, people who are maybe reviewing reports and providing feedback, responding to those things, people who are idea generators and so on. And so sometimes, I'm saying people, and maybe that comes down to one person within your locality, or maybe it is a handful of people. But establishing those clear roles and responsibilities internally and also with the vendor early on is very crucial. That's going to help avoid overlap, confusion, and delays within the project. Also at the onset and throughout the project, communication and coordination are going to be key to the success of the project. And that means, scheduling regular meetings internally, thinking about the reporting structure and who is doing what. Doing that both internally and externally, so that, you know, maybe on Tuesdays you're meeting internally as a team, and on Thursdays you're meeting with the consultant about the project, and just making sure that everyone is informed and aware of what's going on. And so don't work in silos, collaborate with other departments, anticipate that there might be some skill gaps and time constraints. And so, you know, sometimes that means, hey, I'm the lead on this project, so I can no longer do this other daily task. It's just going to take too much of my time. And so maybe someone else is stepping in to that role, but are they going to need some training to get up to speed on that, so that you truly can focus on being the lead for this other project? Or maybe this project is something different that you have less experience with, and you need some training. So just kind of thinking about those things, working preemptively to meet those demands will be important. Next slide.
Thank you. Yeah, steering committees and project teams, you know, certainly for projects that are large enough that you're usually seeking outside assistance with, you'll likely want some type of steering committee or project team. You know, beginning with the RFP stage, you'll want to kind of think about what is who is going to kind of lead and champion this project and kind of shepherd it through the process. That's principally their role. You know, in some cases, hopefully not that much. They you know, can serve as a tiebreaker. You know, if you know, developing the plan, going through the project, there's, you know, a decision to be made, you know, to go left or go right. You know, ultimately, it may be the steering committee that gets to decide what direction should this project or this plan and its outcomes go in. So thinking about that role of the steering committee in guiding projects, and then who's going to comprise that steering committee and who makes the decision about who comprises the members of that steering committee. You know, depending on the topic, the issue, you know, it could be a comprehensive plan versus a small area plan, and there may be different expertise and perspectives that you want participating in those projects. And I would say, in terms of, well, and this kind of goes to team collaboration and ensuring alignment between the project team and the steering committee. So the staff project team and the steering committee, ensuring that that communication channel is there. You know, who is, and this goes to the staffing support, who is communicating between your consultant and the steering committee and elected officials and appointed officials. There's a lot of staff need for that in a lot of cases. And let's say your steering committee is not comprised of elected officials. Who's communicating from the steering committee to the elected officials, to your planning commissions? If you're, and this is something to consider too, if your steering committee has appointees from your elected board or your planning commission, are they reporting back to the boards in terms of updates and getting information back from the boards and carrying that to the steering committee? I think those are a lot of considerations here. I think the goal is, or the overarching principle is that you're achieving buy-in, whether that's public buy-in, which hopefully would be the case regardless, but also eventual buy-in from the bodies that are going to be adopting this plan. And we talk about this often with a lot of our projects, because we do encourage basically joint work sessions between planning commissions and boards for zoning ordinance rewrites or comprehensive plans, because we know those two bodies are going to be the ones that have to review and hold public hearings and make a recommendation and adopt a document. So we want them to be engaged in the process. But that also is a community by community decision. You may have a board that is completely hands off, that they trust staff or they trust stakeholders in the community to steer and shepherd this process. And, you know, ultimately whatever's developed, that they have good faith that it was developed with the good of the entire community. But vice versa, you may have boards that want to be more engaged in the process and develop that. So I think that's something, you need to consider early on how you want to address that in the RFP, because it's something a consultant needs to be aware of. But getting that steering committee formed, who's being appointed to it, how they're being appointed to it, is a major consideration. Rebecca. Oh, let me advance the slide on my actual screen. There we
That's the
go.
slide. All right. So yeah, we're getting close to the finish line, but there are challenges with that. A common challenge at the end of a project is stakeholder fatigue. Stakeholders could be yourself as staff who's been, working on this, drudging through this for, months, maybe years. Could be the governing body, could be a steering committee, could be general public. But being cognizant of that throughout the project to, address any disengagement, consider the number of surveys that you're going to put out. Is this just going to be too much? Consider the meeting times, both the number of times that you're going to be meeting and also the time of day that you're meeting. And those things may need to be shifted throughout the project. So, again, being flexible there, considering the length of the project as well. And so to keep the momentum going, provide bite-sized next steps. Make sure you're celebrating the small wins as well as the big milestones. Hey, we're completely drafted now. Now we're moving into review. So, celebrating those things. And then too, when you get to the end, it may be a need to just prioritize critical tasks. Maybe at the onset you had, lots of big plans and now everyone's tired and you just need to, narrow down and focus to those critical things to get you across the finish line. Also recommend revisiting your project goals and do this with the governing body, with the steering committee, with the public, so that they can be reminded of, oh, hey, this is where we started and we are working towards this. We're almost there. So kind of remembering those project goals in that way and just continuing to have consistent and transparent communication. That goes back to the previous slide where Michael was talking about who is communicating with the governing body and keeping them updated so that when they get to the end of the project, they are ready for adoption. They know and feel comfortable with adoption. And then also, you can provide incentives and rewards for the public to keep them engaged if that's necessary. Also, some projects are challenged by scope creep at the end of a project. So having that strong plan to begin with of knowing what those parameters are and where you're going within the project, and then track your key performance indicators along the way. So thinking about your on-time delivery, thinking about the budget, thinking about the quality of the project or the deliverables. Are you receiving what you thought you were going to receive? Is it matching the quality that you desired? Also, overall stakeholder satisfaction, kind of gauging that along the way so that you're not getting to the end and have a huge, derailment or an impact to deadlines. So just kind of monitoring those things and making small shifts will help so that you don't have a big shift at the end. And to ensure long-term project sustainability, conduct a debriefing, talk about what worked, what didn't work, so that you have insights for future projects. Maybe this is a phase 1 and you're going to be entering into a phase 2, 3. So how can those things be improved, as well as just other projects in the future? Also develop a plan for maintenance and evolution, as well as any training or support that might be needed. Just because this project is done doesn't mean, okay, we shove it aside and we move on to the next thing. There's usually still some things that need to be considered. So making sure that you have a plan for that as well. And I think that wraps us up.
Yeah. Thank you, Rebecca. Kate.
Yeah.
I'll skip through this slide, but now we'll certainly open it up for questions, hopefully answers. But any discussion, any ideas that any of the attendees have as well, we would welcome those. I mean, there's nuances about this that I'm thinking of right now that we could have added to this, but happy to receive any comments or questions that y'all have. And here's our contact information again. And I think Jillian indicated we would send out our personal contact information as well. If you ever have a question, don't hesitate to reach out. So with that, I'll end this and we can open it up if Jillian has any questions or if anyone wants to ask a question.
Yes, well, would you like to start off with some of the, it looks like we had a pitfall. Well, I guess it's not a suggestion, but pitfall opinion in the chat from Lee DeForth. They've learned the hard way that requesting respondents be not only clear about key personnel, but noting that key personnel changes during the project must be approved by the procuring entity can be critical. Staffing changes, it's fine, but making sure those replacement folks are well suited to your project is essential.
And that would be a change in personnel on the consultant side is what I'm picking up.
Yes, she types.
Yeah. Yeah. I've luckily, in my tenure with the Berkley group, we've not seen that happen often, if at all, that I can recall on a significant number of projects. But I think the key from my side as a consultant, but also just thinking about it from the public side, because it has happened on the public side, is having that conversation early, as soon as it's known that there may be a change, making sure that we as a consultant are reaching out to the client to explain the circumstances, I think is the best thing, obviously. It depends on what that personnel is, who the individual is. I can tell you when I was at a locality side, it was the project manager that was leaving. And luckily, that consultant in that project manager that was departing had made some arrangements to still be involved to a degree, and they were moving to a state entity actually where they were still relevant as a stakeholder, so that they could still be engaged. But I think the last thing that you want to do as a consultant is not be upfront and clear about that with your client. But I think just manage that the best you can through communication. But you're right, that could be something that could be a major change to a project depending on the dynamics of it all.
I think it's also important to look at the project team as a whole when you're considering a consultant, and looking at not only who the project manager would be, but potentially who the sub project managers are, knowing that there's some redundancies. There should be some redundancies in skill sets kind of spread throughout the team. So you really want to see a team that together can kind of fill a lot of the gaps, also, just add that.
Absolutely.
And before I hop over to the questions in the Q&A box, it looks like Devonte Caldwell also added to that RFP pitfall discussion, noting that one particular challenge is defining the scope of the project that is clear and is well aligned with the budget.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, I would tell you, and this is something I started doing on the public side, was something I had learned from an earlier webinar related to this, is if you know your project budget, to put it in the RFP. As Kate indicated, all this information is public anyway. So if it's out there, you're going to find it. So put it in the RFP, but be realistic in terms of what your budget is versus the scope. And on occasion, we review project scopes that don't seem to align with what a known budget may be. And certainly you can receive RFP responses, but at that point, you're going to likely have to consider whether or not you're going to break that project up over multiple budget years, which is certainly something you should consider, or have to appropriate more funds for that project. But a lot of the work that you can do up front, finding comparable projects, not just comparable projects, but comparable projects for communities of your size, to better identify, okay, what is a realistic budget for this project based on this scope? So I think, yeah, it's critical that you're aligning what your expectations are for scope and outcomes with a budget. And a lot of the work you can do beforehand can help with that.
Well, in terms of scope, one of our questions actually is for Rebecca. Joseph Bonanno, and apologies if I'm getting any names incorrect, asks if you can define scope creep. I think you had mentioned it in one of your slides.
So some creep would, be that you have, defined, we're going to have 6 sessions and we're going to, hammer out this report. And then you get to the end and it's, well, we're not quite done and we need another 2 sessions to do this. So that would be considered a scope creep item that you would have to talk through with each other and determine, what's the budget implications there and the timing and those types of things.
Thank you. And it looks like we have another question from an anonymous attendee. They say, Rebecca, you are spot on when you mentioned working preemptively. When mentioned, working preemptively can lead to better outcomes, particularly internally. We recently put out an RFP and received 0 proposals. It was a complex project that would have potentially required subs. We reached out to a few local firms to see where the disconnect was, and it was the budget. A few firms said it was way too low for what we were requesting. My question is how to gauge what an appropriate budget is.
Yeah,
And so, I think Michael touched on
go ahead.
that. Yeah, just a minute ago. He must have been reading your mind there. But some of that is reaching out to other communities who have done similar projects and engaging their level of project against your level of project as well, because some localities say, yes, we want all the bells and whistles and we can afford it. And other localities say, well, we want this, but maybe we can't, do as robust of engagement or, things like that. And so considering that as well, but, looking to other communities and seeing, hey, what did you have to pay for this? What were the costs that came in for you for this particular project?
Yeah, and I would, and I think it's important too to acknowledge there may be multiple different reasons why you're not going to get a lot of responses or you don't get a lot of responses. And I think we touched on a lot of these. Budget certainly is one of them. And I think there's ways you can try to better understand and narrow down what the budget could be for a project of this type. But I think Kate indicated, if you release an RFP for a comprehensive plan and responses are due in 15 days, you're not giving yourself the benefit of allowing a lot of different consultants the time to evaluate that and prepare it. And if there's an expectation or a need for teaming partners, it takes time to coordinate with teaming partners to get everyone on the same page to comprise that proposal, especially if there's a budget component that needs to be spitted as part of that. And you should also think about when you're scoping the timeline for the project. If you dictate the project has to start now, this date, and it has to end here, you're going to potentially discount, throw out other firms, potentially some firms that don't have the ability within those narrow timeframes to deliver the work that you need. From our perspective, when we see a proposal, we want to have a confidence level that we can deliver those services to you. And if we can't appropriately have the time to formulate that response, then we're not necessarily going to respond to that. And if we look at our internal calendar about project load and workload, and we can't meet your expectations, we may not be able to respond to that either. And we don't pretend to understand that those timelines are not important to you, but I will tell you just from experience, I know a few consultants in Massachusetts, for instance, and they just released a state requirement that they have to comply with what's called the MBTA communities law. So every locality that's served by the MBTA public transportation has to come up with housing ordinance updates. Every consultant in the state for all of those communities is tied up working on those. There's no capacity. So the same thing happened when every community, not every community, where a lot of communities received ARPA funding. There's only but so many consultants that can provide work and deliver the projects that communities need. And, the same demands on resources that you have at the local level, we have similar demands to our clients that are already engaged either on projects that we're working on or projects that are planned. And so you really have to think about that. Who's available? Is your schedule rigid? Can you have any flexibility? So I think there's a few different things: budget, timeline, response date, probably some others that I'm forgetting, that really, may result in fewer responses.
Thank you, Michael. And it looks like we actually just got one more question. Do you have to advertise RFP on EVA now?
Rebecca, do you know if that's a requirement?
I don't.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we've certainly seen ones that have not been advertised on EVA, but I don't know that that's determinative one way or the other. I don't know if anyone's on the webinar that knows definitively.
Looks like Mary Zirkle just noted that it's not a requirement if it's in a newspaper.
There we go. Thank you, Mary.
And my apologies for getting the acronym wrong.
It's all right. GIF, JIF, EVA, yeah. Any other thoughts that people have that, even if it's a thought that you want to share for the benefit of the group? I think I think one more that I'll share, and we kind of touched on this, but it may be capacity, when you're considering a project, considering the timeline, avoid as best you can working in silos across your organization. Yes, you're managing planning, and your focus is on planning, and you have these responsibilities and commitments, but recognize what other departments are doing and what their needs are, what their responsibilities are to your project as well. Yes, a comprehensive plan is principally a planning function, but you need time and input from other resources in your community to make sure it's a successful project. And I would say that's also true of your public. Sometimes we've worked with localities that they're doing a lot, and that's great. But if you've got multiple initiatives going on and there's multiple community surveys on, this certain aspect of the community or this other aspect, you can burn your public out too, and they won't know what to focus on, or they'll say, oh my gosh, I just went to a meeting, on this last week, and now this is talking about the same thing or something similar. So be cognizant of that. And I think that goes back to, being very deliberate in planning your work plan year to year, putting projects and initiatives that are of this magnitude within your CIP, really going out and, even though you may not have funding today, programming that plan in and making sure it aligns with everyone else's work plan. I think that's important for the organization. So hopefully that thought helps too.
Well, thank you. And I don't see any other questions at the moment, but as I wrap up, feel free to put any last minute questions in the chat, attendees, or in the Q&A. Thank you so much, Michael, Rebecca, and Kate. I really appreciate your participation in the series, and for the Berkley Group support the series. I think our attendees are walking away with a lot of valuable insights on crafting effective RFPs and project management as a whole. So I really appreciate it. Folks, I'm sorry, at the beginning of the webinar, I said that I would share more about the recording and I failed to do that. So you will be able to see the recording of this webinar on our chapter's YouTube page, which is linked in the chat, in just a few days, and a follow-up email as our speakers mentioned, we'll be sending out their contact information and the slide deck to all attendees, and that will include the link to the recording as well. But I really appreciate our speakers and our attendees for being with us this afternoon.
Thanks for having us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yep, thank you.